The first commercial radio station went on the air on November 2nd, 1920. And over the 50 years that followed, Americans slowly started adopting the radio into their homes. By 1960, almost every household owned a radio. Since then, every subsequent technological advancement has more quickly integrated into our daily lives.
And it took only 20 years from its official introduction in 1993 for the internet to become a household staple. And now over 92% of the US population uses the internet. The use of social media and smartphones skyrocketed even more rapidly since they came on the scene in the early 2000s.
Since the earliest days of the internet, social scientists, anthropologists, and neuroscientists have been attempting to understand its impact on our society, culture, and mental health. Facebook remains the most widely used social media platform, outpacing Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, and LinkedIn.
Whether you are 18 or 62, you can connect with 70% of your peers on Facebook. But different platforms have developed their own demographic niches. For example, Instagram is home to the 18 to 29-year-olds. Women use Pinterest more often, and more than half of Reddit's users are men.
Primitive social media platforms existed for the simple purpose of connecting users with friends via online profiles. One's online persona became something to be concerned about, and keeping up with messages, likes, comments, and pokes, remember those? Became urgent. So, what have been the impacts of having a huge social network and an endless stream of content available at your fingertips?
In this 360 Perspective episode, we are exploring the effects of social media on mental health, the good and the bad, and how we might be able to use social media as a tool in healthcare.
最前沿的科学研究
Science
Innovation und Wissenschaft
كنترول
مدى
Scienza
التكنولوجيا
достижения
كشف جديد
Scienza
Pesquisa Discovery Rehashing Science.
We'd like to thank Untapped Resources for sponsoring Science Rehashed. Untapped Resources is a Boston-based foundation that funds the arts, sciences, education, and creative initiatives of people working to improve lives, celebrate community, and solve local problems. With support from the Untapped Resources grant program, we are committed to making science more inclusive and accessible for scientists and the science curious worldwide.
How do you decide what side of yourself you present to the world? At school or at work, you can control how you dress, how you speak, and how you act at a certain extent. But it is very difficult to control every aspect of your natural tendencies.
Social media gives us the chance to pick and choose the parts of ourselves to show to the world. In a way, it actually requires it. We're encouraged to make our profiles a caricature of our true selves, exaggerated versions rooted in ground truths. But does amplifying parts of ourselves enrich our sense of identity, or does it reduce it?
And we wanted to explore this idea further. So we talked to PhD student Louisa Fassi, who studies how rapid technological growth and online social networks have influenced development in young people.
So, hi, I'm Luisa. I'm a second year PhD student, and I work at the University of Cambridge across two departments, the Department of Psychiatry and the MRC Cognition and Brain Sciences unit. So I was following for some time the public debates about social media and mental health. And because there's been this increasing trend of mental health conditions, especially among young people, that has been reported globally in the UK, but also in other countries, both in the global north and global south, I was interested in understanding what might be the reasons for this increase in mental health. Is it because people are becoming more aware that mental health is actually a thing? Or is it because actually there's something that is driving it? And some of the debates really pointed to social media as being kind of the cause for this increase in mental health. And at the beginning, I was skeptical. I was thinking whether this might really be the case. So I started digging into the research and seeing whether there's were really evidence for it. And that's how I got interested in the field of social media and mental health, basically.
Sometimes people like to separate their real life from online life. And I'm wondering to what extent you think that's even possible, right? Or do you think that social media is sort of like a natural extension of human society and sociality, or is it like a totally different thing?
Yeah, so the question is whether social media is something separate. I'm going to reformulate it. So it's something separate where we project parts of our identity, or it's kind of an extension. And to what extent we should, or does it make sense to keep it as separate or actually combine them, basically? It depends, and it might be different from different people. I think it can hardly be the case that it's completely separate, your like offline experience and the online one. So the way I look at it is really on a continuum, where of course you're not going to be hardly the same person online and offline, because offline there's so much complexity and nuances that online spaces don't allow you to express. So I do believe that online versions are somewhat simplified, and people try to portray maybe different aspects, or they might be selective in the way they choose which aspects of themselves to share. But I do see it more as a continuum rather than something completely separate. And also because in the online spaces, we keep getting feedback about ourselves and the identity that we decide to project. That, I think, is something that we bring offline as well, in the way we think of ourselves, in the way that our identity develops, especially during adolescence year. I think identity formation is probably one of the topics that I'm becoming more and more interested in. Like, how do we grow and like build our own identity in like an online world? How do we integrate feedback from all offline compared to online? And that all relates to this kind of spectrum. Yeah.
Anecdotally, when I'm scrolling on Instagram Explorer, or I don't have a TikTok because I think it's too addictive, but like, my friends have TikToks, and I've been talking with my friends about how it seems like everything has a label. You talking about social media identities or online persona being more simplified than the complex person that you are in real life, and that reminded me of what I've been talking about with my friends, which is that it seems like everything has to have like a label, right? Like you can't just like the cozy feeling of the fall, that's cottagecore, or you can't just, like reading, I don't know, fairy tales, that's like fairy core. It seems anecdotally like there's pressure to kind of like label every part of yourself.
And kind of separate it as well. Like,
yes,
oftentimes if you have different identities, what you would do is do separate profiles. Like you can have your like surfing profile, your yoga profile, your intellectual profile, whereas it's harder to kind of have everything in the same profile, because then people are like, wait, what?
yeah. I'm not interested in the surfing, I'm only interested in the yoga. Or
Yeah, and I think that also relates to the fact that because it's used as a platform for like communication and staying informed, people tend to look for specific types of content. So if you actually give a certain type of content, then it is informative if somebody is interested in that specifically. But of course, then it kind of goes away from reflecting who you are as a person. And it can be argued if that's the goal, right? And I don't know that. Like, is it the goal to actually be you in your like totality on social media? Or maybe it shouldn't be. It should be just to like portray a certain part. And yeah, it's hard.
Moving on to the social media aspect of your research, which I'm so excited to hear more about, you speak a lot on the nuances of the research behind social media and how we shouldn't take a monolithic view of the problem, right? It's all good, it's all bad. But, I'm sure there are some examples of like really good social media use or really bad social media use. So could you describe for us one of the clear advantages of social media and one of the clear disadvantages of social media use today?
Yeah. So, in terms of advantages, I think one of the things that research has started to show is that something like digital inclusion can have real good implications. So, the fact that some parts of the world that might be digitally excluded actually get to use technology for education and for other purposes, and that can have good impact, especially for empowering different minority groups, for instance. So, there's another researcher in my group, Sakshi Gai. She's a third-year PhD student, and she's doing a lot of research on the global south. And she has studied how, for instance, digital inclusion and digitalization of women in rural India is actually has good effects. And yeah, so there are some aspects in terms of types of use of social media, I think there's also some research showing that looking at inspirational content can be beneficial. So exploring one's interest, being exposed to something that is inspirational for young people, as well as connecting and communicating with others.
Yeah, like I imagine that connectedness and like finding role models and just kind of being part of the global discourse. It's like a really, it's the best use case, right, of social media.
Exactly, especially for those that feel particularly isolated. Actually, it can be empowering to have something like social media or technology as a way of communicating.
Absolutely. And what about like one clear disadvantage?
Yeah, so I can think of a few. Sticking to the content aspect of things, there are certain types of content that are undeniably harmful for mental health specifically. For instance, exposure to self-harm content. I cannot think of any reason for this to be neutral or beneficial. So there are certain types of content that can be really harmful. And that, of course, like would be the same in an offline setting. Like exposure to self-harm in offline, we also wouldn't expect it to be beneficial. But of course, social media provide a platform for constant and easier access to this type of contents.
Right. You can't like look up in the real world, where can I find this type of content, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So self-harm is like one that I would say is that at the very extreme of the spectrum of being harmful. There's other aspects that are a bit more nuanced, which I think might be harmful for specific groups. Let's say exposure to thinness ideas and like bodies and specific images of bodies. I think those generally exposure to a lot of content related to bodies has been associated with lower mental health and self-esteem, particularly in girls. But also this seems to be the case for girls that might have already predisposition for like eating disorders or that might not have high self-esteem to begin with. So I think there are, for instance, so in this case, it's a bit more nuanced. It might not be harmful for everybody, but it could be for specific groups.
And so I have a question about sort of like how you find your research question, right? So to me, thinking about this broad subject like social media and development and mental health and youth, that sounds like such a daunting question, right? Is social media good or bad for youth, So how do you go about breaking this really important research down into bite-sized questions?
It's a struggle. I want to be honest. It's very difficult. And it's probably the most difficult part of my research is actually to boil down, like, what do I want to study? Because it's the general question of social media and mental health. Like, I don't think is scientifically answerable.
No.
But because you can look at it from so many different perspectives, which one do you choose? And I think the link to policy and more practical applications has been very helpful for me to kind of narrow down my scope. So the way I think of formulating my questions, like I ask myself, well, which type of question do I see having an impact in terms of regulations, in terms of telling young people maybe stop doing this type of social media use and move to these other types of social media use, as well as in terms of who am I doing this research for? Am I doing the research for all adolescents, for adolescents that struggle with something in particular? Like, who do I want to help? So I think these two aspects, the who and the what practical implications it has been helpful for me in deciding.
Are you wondering what our team is up to and want to get to know us better? Follow us on Instagram, where you can learn more about our talented team from around the world. Our interests go far beyond science, from illustration to bike riding and more. You can find us on Instagram at Science Rehashed. That's at Science REHASHED. Peer into the lives of our team members during their Instagram takeovers. We love featuring our cats. And have more fun with us through giveaways and quizzes.
We asked some of our listeners how they use social media. Here's what they had to say.
I use it to distract myself from my responsibilities, and laugh and find something funny and find something relatable, ideally.
I use social media mainly to entertain myself. I think I spend most of my time on YouTube just watching people like react to things. So I guess like kind of like de-stress and like entertain myself.
I feel like it's designed to like suck you in. Like once you start, you can't get out. Like that's one of the reasons I'm not on TikTok, because like I can only have one of those, and for me that's Instagram Reels right now.
So we all use social media in a myriad of ways, for entertainment, for information, to stay connected.
I deleted all my socials, but I have YouTube.
Okay, so Mehdi is chronically offline, but our next guest actually makes her living on it.
Some of you may know her from her long history of internet presence in the gaming world, content ranging from Star Wars, tabletop, RPGs to hosting on the gaming network, then to Twitch streaming on Fandom.
We talked to Emma Fife about making a career of her fabulous personality and the effects of the blue check mark on her mental well-being.
My name is Emma Fife. I am currently a gaming content producer at Fandom. If you're unfamiliar with Fandom, you probably have been to one of Fandom's many, many wikis. Wikipedia is one that I often cite that people are familiar with, which is the Star Wars wiki, which is basically where fans of Star Wars have all come together to document every single piece of information you could ever possibly want to know about Star Wars. A lot of what I do at Fandom these days is creating branded content for companies that are essentially paying for ad placement within the Fandom platform. And, you know, we run the custom video and stuff that we do in a very targeted sort of way. So, for example, if it's something like I did a project earlier this year for the FDA of all clients, they were effectively anti-smoking PSAs, but they were all around gaming. And so, you know, those ran on our gaming wikis because they target a very specific audience. We have an on-site video player that's able to do that. But I've worked in internet forever.
Emma has around 24,000 followers on Twitter, 18,000 followers on Instagram, 3,000 on Twitch, over 900 followers on YouTube, and over 1,000 on TikTok. She performs for an audience of 77,000 on Fandom, a show on Twitch.
And so our audience and Mehdi might not be familiar with Twitch as a social platform.
Yeah.
So
Totally.
Can you quickly explain from your own point of view what the purpose of Twitch is, what people use it for, and like
Totally.
One more I'm going to throw in there for you, how it fits in the scope of your larger online presence.
Twitch as a platform primarily came into notoriety for hosting game streams. So it was effectively initially a platform where people would show up and they would play video games and have a camera on their face and talk to the people that were watching them play games. Now, to me, this concept made perfect sense because when I was a kid, I often would play one-player games together with my brother, or even more so, I remember when the original Resident Evil came out in 95.
Gotcha.
95, 96, somewhere around that. So I was basically 9 or 10 years old when this game came out. And so I was a little young to play it, but my friend had a brother who was 3 years older than us, and he had rented it from Blockbuster and was playing it.
Okay.
And I happened to be like running through the living room where he was playing, and I caught him playing some of it. And then I stopped playing with her for the rest of the night because I just sat down to watch him play this video game because I was so invested in what was happening and what was going on with the story, and sharing that experience with him.
So he was like the OJ streamer.
Yeah, he was like my OG streamer. So again, the concept to me of watching other people play video games, to some people they hear that and they go like, why would anybody want to do that? But it made sense to me because I always liked sharing in the experience of a video game with another person, even if that game was a one-player game. And so there was this company that was sort of an offshoot of some people at Geek and Sundry had started Hyper RPG, and they basically reached out to me in like late 2016, early 2017, and were like, hey, would you want to do a Star Wars tabletop RPG? And I said, absolutely. And so through my experiences there is where I kind of learned to really appreciate the platform of Twitch and just the community aspect of it that really gets built around certain streamers or streaming companies, where they really are reliant on this idea of sort of the personality-based content, and having the audience really come to love the people who they are seeing on camera and have these really great interactions with them. So yeah.
Have you ever seen yourself working a more traditional 9 to 5 career like us?
No, I really haven't. It's
Are
funny.
you calling this a 9 to 5 career? It's like a 24-hour career. What is this?
And this is the second job, right? We are.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting. I mean, I kind of have, because I am like employed at a company, I have as sort of 9 to 5 as you can get in my field, but it's certainly not a traditional kind of 9 to 5. For me, it's like the live streaming stuff we do at Fandom and that I do on my own and that I do for other companies is just like a component of this sort of internet persona, I guess, that I am.
So can you elaborate a little bit more about the pros and cons of the live streaming career?
Yeah, so it's, the pros of it is the constant external validation. You're surrounded
I love
by
that.
a lot of, yeah, it's constant external validation. It's people showing up, showing a very immediate interest in what you're doing, giving you feedback, interacting with you. One of the things that I found to be really positive about it was in 2020, which was when I actually started, to stream on my own personal Twitch channel and not just like making guest appearances on other channels or doing shows for other channels. Was that it really provided this sort of nice sense of doing something that was outside of your home, even though I wasn't going anywhere, and also like companionship because you're interacting with people in chat. And like mostly that is a positive thing, but you do also then have to deal a lot with sort of parasocial relationships, and kind of understanding where to create those boundaries around like, hey, I super appreciate your support and I value you as a part of my community, but like we're not friends in the way that I'm friends with, my neighbor who I know in real life and I'm going to go get dinner with, or, something like that.
So it comes with its own challenge to deal and engage with such a large audience.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, especially with things like within Twitch, as long as you are sort of keeping it to your own community or other trusted communities, you tend to have generally pretty positive experiences. And of course, as the audience grows exponentially, so do your chances of having negative interactions. But with something like having a presence on other social media platforms, but like on Twitter, it's like your tweet is getting retweeted by people, and when people like it, it's showing up on people's timelines, and so inevitably it ends up far removed from anybody that has any sort of level of interest in anything that you're doing, and then you find yourself under attack and you're like, who is this person and why do they care? And a lot of, I think, what I've come to learn from many years of navigating mean comments on YouTube and mean tweets, etc., is that it's so rarely actually about you. And it's so much more about the user and them feeling this sense of purpose and anonymity with being on the internet.
And I'm wondering a little bit more now about kind of like the separation between like work and like life, right? And so especially because
Yes.
like so much of these are
Is there a separation?
Is there? And like how has it affected your mental well-being if you're comfortable talking about that, or like the effect you see kind of on your daily life?
It's tough. I cannot lie. They always talk about the fact the royal they being just anybody on the internet. Lots of people in my field in particular say, what you see on the internet is always only the best aspects of people's lives. So you can definitely feel like everybody else is getting wins and you aren't, because people are posting about their wins. This is just like from a professional standpoint, and feeling like you need to constantly be engaging and being tapped into what's going on. All of that does get very exhausting. And so I remember actually in 2020 when we all had to go into lockdown, I felt this weird sense of calm, because I went, oh, cool. The playing field's been leveled. Like
we're all doing bad.
Nobody's out there getting the yeah, we're all doing bad. And yeah, so yeah, there's the professional aspect of it, of you're constantly seeing other people in your field posting about all this great stuff that's happening for them, and you're going, well, why not me? Meanwhile, you have to think in the back of your brain, when you post something cool that you're doing, they're thinking, why not me? And then the other aspect is, again, the people constantly replying to you or tweeting at you and demanding your attention. And I think that you have to get really good at basically saying, you know what, that's enough Twitter for today. I am walking away.
Does this separate you from engaging in the real world?
No. Well, I think it did early on. I really do. I think, initially when you start getting that like constant external validation from strangers on the internet, it feels so good to be like, people who don't know me in real life know who I am and they care. People will still show up for you even if you're not engaging with them 24/7.
Do you think it's mostly content-driven influence or personality-driven?
I saw somebody post something the other day about the tendency we have to make everything in our lives about content. So it's like going to dinner and taking photos of what you ate and posting that on Instagram and sharing stories to show like, look, I'm doing cool things and going out there. It's like this weird microcosm of effectively creating your own like tabloids almost, I would say. You're essentially curating a narrative around your own life, and you have to also find a way to separate your real life from that narrative.
Do you think that there's any upsides of social media in terms of its role in generating connectedness, or like, because we're up against, of course, there's like very realistic parts of like being connected all the time, right? But it's a complicated topic, right? It's not like it's all bad or it's all good or like
it's not. Oh, no, it's such a complicated topic because, I see the people in my little personal Twitch community when I, stream on my own channel, the people that show up and are in my Discord server. And, they all follow me on Twitter and they're all crossovers from other things that I've done, be it, Screen Junkies, Collider, Nerdist, what have you. They've kind of all congregated, like the sort of Emma super fans, if you will, kind of congregated in this one little place. And, now all of them, they like make time to play over our Discord server. They like play a D&D game together and they watch movies together. And so it's like, there is a really positive aspect of social media of being able to connect with other people that really like the same stuff that you do, when you might live in an area where you're not necessarily finding friends who you feel like you connect with on a really deep level and really like share the same interests and get you. So that aspect of it is really positive in that like it does connect these people. And I've made great friends from people who I have met over Twitter. Now, granted, they are for the most part people that are in my field effectively, or in adjacent fields, either they're in broadcast, or they're in movies and TV, or in gaming in some way or another. So yeah, it's a complicated thing, because again, but then you're also dealing with the unrealistic expectations of life based on what you're seeing online, and also dealing with, a lot of people yelling at each other, and the way that these algorithms feed through, you can find yourself really in an echo chamber, where it's just a bunch of people yelling in agreement about stuff.
Great.
So yeah, it's complicated. It's really complicated. I mean, I think for me, it's that when it comes to social media, engage with what brings you joy. For me, I think that when people come back at me when I post something with the same sort of sense of humor that I do, or with an attempt at a sense of humor, you can really foster this very positive and enjoyable kind of experience. I think, when you show up with a specific kind of energy, when people give you that energy back, that's worth giving your energy to. And when people are coming at you with an energy that is not what you're putting out there, just ignore it, because they're just trying to steal your energy. And it's limited. Life is too short to get involved in Twitter feuds.
If you're enjoying the show and want to help us keep making content, please consider becoming one of our patrons on Patreon. Find us at patreon.com/join/science-rehashed to become a patron for just $3 a month. Or you can become a VIP patron for just $5 a month. Our first 10 VIP patrons will receive a free Science Rehash water bottle. That's patreon.com/join/science-rehashed to join.
Do our listeners think people spend too much time on social media?
Definitely. People spend too much time on social media.
Yeah. And I've taken myself off social media a bunch of times, so would I do it again? For sure. Delete it?
I don't think you could.
So far, we have talked about the effects of social media on people's mental well-being, but we are going to switch gears and discuss how social media is being used as a platform to express mental health.
PhD candidate Sean Kelly researches the patterns on social media that are indicative of mental health disorders like depression. With so much user-generated content online, we have access to people's thoughts, opinions, memories, and more, albeit the filtered versions.
Sean and his colleagues have been using algorithmic approaches to identify the language and usage patterns most common in depression, even before people are diagnosed.
Yeah, so I did my my bachelor's and master's in neuroscience, and I really wanted to kind of transition from my PhD into things that are more kind of clinically relevant and applied. And when I started my PhD, I was starting in kind of a new lab, and there wasn't too much data already available to play around with. So basically, I was looking to see how could I start my PhD looking at depression vulnerability and trying to understand how some people are more prone to becoming depressed than others. And I started reading a lot about kind of social media work on depression using Twitter or Reddit. And it seemed like a very new and rich data source that we could use essentially to be able to monitor depression over much longer periods of time than people are really able to do using kind of lab-based methods. We think for mental health disorders, it doesn't really make sense to think of this kind of latent cause model, because under a latent cause model, essentially symptoms, they can have no causal relationships between each other. And the presence of symptoms does not necessarily dictate the presence of a disorder. While that really doesn't make sense in mental health, for depression, you really have to have symptoms in order to be able to be diagnosed with the disorder. And of course, it makes sense that these symptoms should interact with each other. So if someone's feeling say they feel down or they feel more tired, that should then cause them to maybe have some insomnia, or should lead to a kind of a cascade of events that can then kind of trigger the transitions into states of depression.
You talked about going on Reddit and kind of finding these forums, right? And thinking of this as a rich data set, the social media data as a rich data set. Why are these data, like tweets, for example, so useful when evaluating mental health?
Yeah, so kind of another thing that's very valuable about them is just over how long kind of periods of time you can get data from these social media sources. So one of the things that we used Twitter data for was we can collect data. We collected data up to a year prior to when people completed surveys, but you could do it even longer. And it's really not possible to have, say, people rate their mental health for a couple of years and collect really large samples for that. So not only are you getting this very kind of rich emotional data set that people are already providing us, but you're able to capture that data over really long periods of time.
Just a couple of clarifying questions. So first, when you're predicting depression and you're building these models, how do you establish the ground truth?
We use depression questionnaires, so validated questionnaires, to establish ground truth measures. So that's very tricky, actually, and it's kind of a big kind of topic of contention in a lot of this work, is that there's a big trade-off between establishing valid ground truth measures of depression through, say, questionnaires, and then kind of being limited to smaller samples, or using larger samples, but then having to estimate kind of proxies for depression. So a lot of kind of keywords. So people saying, I'm depressed, or I was diagnosed with depressed. And actually, in one of my papers, I kind of looked at that distinction to see what the effect would be on kind of predictive performance, because we were getting values for prediction that were kind of much lower than was reported in the literature. So we kind of wanted to see if we could understand perhaps a bit more about why that was the case. And what we found was that if you're actually using these kind of say worse ground truth estimates of depression using depression keywords, you can actually get much better predictive performance than if you're using depression questionnaires, which we think are going to be much more closely related to that ground truth.
Are there any other language cues that you look for?
So basically, there's a few different things you can do. One is what are kind of called closed library techniques. So these are just to see how many words in a tweet or a post correspond to different categories, like the number of negative words or the number of negative emotions. And then more sophisticated techniques kind of build on that, and they look at how words cluster together. So if someone is using, say, swear words and negative emotion words together, that can also be indicative of depression.
Well, that will take me, well, remind me of a book called We Are Not Ourselves by, I think, Matthew Thomas. And so my question is, how are we ourselves in social media, and how do people tend to represent themselves on social media, and how can you use this to detect mental illness? Like at the first place, do you think that tweets are an accurate depictions of a person's internal mental state?
It's tricky to evaluate in many ways, because there is a lot of filtering on social media. I think there's a famous quote from one paper that's I have problems, but I'm not posting them on Facebook necessarily. So it's certainly for a lot of people, they are not showing necessarily their true selves. But if you look at what features of language are predictive of depression from social media, and features that are, say, predictive of depression from essays or kind of blog posts that people write, maybe more kind of personal than they would be on social media, they're often similar features, and there's a lot of convergence in the literature around this. So in many ways, it's maybe a little worse than you would get, but it's quite similar to what you would see in other sources of data. But what's really cool about social media is that it can be kind of deployed more at scale than these other forms. So kind of large-scale population monitoring that's otherwise very difficult to do through any other sources, as well as providing kind of a rich test bed for research questions.
When you say monitoring, can you a little bit clarify what does monitoring means? Are like using these social media tweets as an indicator of depression, or are you tracking the progression of mental health?
From kind of what we've seen, it wouldn't really be used for monitoring, say, an individual's depression. It seems the models don't perform really well enough to kind of track individual health over time. And there are also ethical questions about using social media to make these kind of individual level predictions. But it would be very useful, say, in a kind of a public health context for understanding broad changes in, say, subnational levels of mental health. And it's also even been used for physical health. There's a paper that looked at using Twitter to monitor rates of, I believe, cardiovascular health at the US county level. So really, we think that for these kind of large-scale population monitoring, social media is kind of the most useful there.
That lends itself to my next question. You talk about monitoring in social media, right? But do you think that social media itself is having a negative or positive effect on people's mental health?
Yeah. So it's been a challenging few years in the literature, seeing kind of what exactly is the effect of social media on mental health. So a lot of the literature previously did report, these negative associations between social media use and well-being, but kind of a lot of that was self-reported use of social media, so not necessarily the best measures. And some of the more robust findings now of actual time spent on social media seems to indicate that it has kind of minimal negative effects on mental health. But also that maybe in certain subgroups that there are stronger effects. So I think in teenagers, particularly teenage girls, the Instagram use has a pretty profound effect, negative effect on mental health. So it's not necessarily equally distributed through the population.
Can one think about expanding this idea of using social media data to smartphone data? And can you use that smartphone data to track or monitor mental health?
Yeah, there's quite a bit of research now out there about using what are kind of called passive data features from smartphones to understand mental health. So things like physical activity or location. So people with depression, for instance, tend to spend more time at home and don't travel to as many locations. And these are all features that can be picked up from kind of smartphones and also being done on wearables now. So there's a lot of really interest in this for being able to do really long-term monitoring of depression, and also being able to capture some of the behavioral components of depression more accurately than you could get through, say, self-reported questionnaires. So it's a very hot area of research, and also being done in other disorders such as schizophrenia or anxiety.
How early do you think in mental health decline would you be able to detect it?
There's a lot of issues right now going on with social media. And a lot of people, especially younger people, are kind of moving towards more private platforms, just to, end-to-end encrypted platforms, so their messages aren't as available. But people are still looking at sites like Reddit or these kind of forums for understanding their mental health. So there's still a lot of scope for monitoring or tracking mental health through social media, even if it's not done necessarily at the individual level with people posting, say, to Facebook or Instagram or Twitter anymore. And even things like even apps like TikTok, they're very video based, and a lot of the social media research hasn't actually moved to video yet, or even very much to images. It's still very much text based. A lot of these models for mental health, based on language generally, not just depression, aren't necessarily very specific to a lot of these disorders. So even if you develop algorithms that can kind of detect depression, they're not necessarily very specific to depression. So in one of my kind of research papers, we showed basically that if you train an algorithm on cases of depression, it does also with similar performance to, say, generalized anxiety or OCD and these other kind of conditions. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to understand maybe symptoms that are more kind of transdiagnostic and not necessarily looking at individual categories of mental health. As we know, a lot of these diagnoses from the DSM aren't based necessarily in the biology of mental health or in any kind of neural basis. So there's a lot of overlap in symptoms between different disorders. So it's very hard to kind of tease apart what is unique to one disorder and what's specific to that particular condition.
If you're enjoying this episode, join the conversation with us on Twitter @ScienceRehashed, where we will be rehashing this episode. Don't forget to follow us on all of our social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram @ScienceRehashed, to stay in the loop about our new episodes and upcoming interviews.
How old were you when you first got a social account?
I think I was probably in my late 40s or early 50s.
What was it?
It was Facebook, and I did it because at the time I was working in public schools, and I was working in the sort of family engagement field. And one of the things that I was finding was that parents had like no idea how to navigate the social media their kids were using, and they were terrified of it, and they thought it was just like universally awful. But they also had never seen it. And so it seemed to me that in order to have an intelligent conversation with your kid, you have to know what you're doing. So I would do workshops where I would get the school department blocked all social media at that point, and I would get them to unblock it for like an hour in an evening, and I would run a workshop for parents on like, here's how you like make a Facebook account, you know. And it was very well attended, and people were, I think, in those couple of years when that was just like new and hard for people to understand, hard for grown-ups to understand, I think they were really, it was really well received.
When we asked some of our other listeners how old they were, here's what they had to say.
Middle school, I was probably 12 or 13.
I hate to say it, but I was like 13.
I was 10. I was 10 years old.
Are you left with more thoughts or questions after listening to a Science Rehash episode? Join us on Twitter @ScienceRehashed and leave your comments, thoughts, questions, etc. on the episode Twitter thread to rehash this episode using hashtag #SREpisodeRehashed. In 2022, 97% of teenagers reported using the internet on a daily basis, and most of them admitted that it would be hard to give up social media.
Not only are most teens on social media every day, but the patterns in which they use it have dramatically shifted in recent years. Since 2014, the number of teens who say they are on the internet constantly has doubled, and almost all of them say they use it many times per day.
This speaks volumes to the culture shift in how teens exist in their daily lives and what's required of them in their social spheres.
But researchers are leveraging social media and technology as a whole in hopes to combat mental health issues.
At Northwestern University, Dr. Ashley Knapp is developing digital tools that will give teens coping strategies to use during moments of anxiety. Most importantly, her team is working to ensure that these tools will be accessible and engaging.
So I am Dr. Ashley Knapp. I'm an assistant professor at the med school within Northwestern University, so Feinberg School of Medicine in particular. My research mainly focuses on working with teens and working with teens around mental health. So I'm really interested in how do we use technology and in particular smartphones and web programs to help kids get more access to mental health literacy, as well as tools and things like that. So I'm currently working with the library actually to think through how can we get digital mental health tools within the library, since the library is open to the public and a really welcoming place for teens.
You have conducted several studies on this topic, especially in teenagers. The question is, so what inspired you to explore these questions through research?
Ooh, that's a good question. And so I will say, I likely will go towards social media, but in particular, I'm using more technology. And I think what kind of led me there, because I first started off just researching anxiety and how to help teens with anxiety just manage. And I think as cell phones became more popular and as technology became more popular and broadband, it just seemed like a really or a lot easier way to reach teens and increase accessibility. So we have so many of these resources available that honestly are just dying in research laboratories and not getting into the hands that need them. And so I think that's probably the biggest reason was just how do we increase accessibility and just get the tools to the teens.
Can you go into a little bit more detail about these digital mental health tools? Like,
Yeah.
what are some examples and how have they changed, right? You mentioned that a lot of them are dying in these research labs. So, what are these advances?
Let's see. So I think examples that are more commercial based would be like Calm or Wobot, if you've seen like that. Those are more app based. So there was this huge wave of digital mental health apps and kind of following that train. But in academia, we realized it's really difficult to keep up with all the money that's getting thrown at companies and mental health in our world. And so what we've kind of done, I guess, recently is take a step back and think, okay, how can we really create programs within the resources that we have and then also get them to the teams that need them. But example programs, let's see. So I'm working with the library right now, so I can give an example of that. It's been pretty fun because we really take an approach of co-design and working with teens at the library and with staff at the library. So what we've been doing lately is instead of there are social workers in libraries recently, which is pretty cool, but there's not typically a therapist in libraries. And so what we're trying to do is it won't necessarily be therapy, it won't necessarily be anything like that, but it will be how do we teach coping skills? And we're actually at the really early stages, was pretty cool. So we are going to do some low fidelity prototyping or just get some wireframes or put some things in front of the teams, and they'll be like, "We love this" or "We hate this." And what's nice,
cool.
yeah, what's nice with teens is they tell you what they think, which I personally love. I'm like, I need to know where we stand.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah. So I think unfortunately the reason why they're dying is the ivory tower syndrome, where we're not just and thankfully there's this whole science that was born, implementation science, that really works on okay, we can test these programs in the laboratory, but we need to actually test them in environments like libraries or schools. We need to actually get them out. Oh, and then so the other big thing that we're probably likely going to put in, but again, it's pretty cool because we're just at the beginning stages is trying to get increased access. So, what mental health resources are already in the community that aren't really realized or and especially known by parents and teens? So that will likely could be a little kind of step before therapy. This is more hopefully a prevention approach, or at least getting folks kind of a warm handoff to treatment within the community.
I see. So it's more like you're in the middle of an anxiety episode, you don't know what to do, here's some
Yeah,
tools to cope before
exactly.
you can get to therapy. I
Yeah,
see.
exactly. And hopefully we'll make it in an engaging ways. And that's why I love having teen investigators and working with teens is we can kind of think through, okay, we come in with this clinical concept or what we know of the literature, and then how do we make this where you like it and where you're
Yeah.
not just gonna not use it, or you're just gonna use it for a day or two and and then lop off. So there's been some folks that have tried to work on engagement. So every time you do a coping strategy, your tree grows, or you get to put a fish in the
That's
pond. Yeah, and so those I've heard recently are pretty lame, according to the teens. So we're going to try to think of other engagement techniques such as that, so we can kind of marry the science with what the kids will actually, or they don't like when I say kids, rightfully so. The teens, what they will actually enjoy and kind of log on.
I've seen those like ads on Instagram for these apps that are like trying to keep a fish alive has like really helped. Like I can't deal with my own task trying to keep a fish alive or water my
Yep.
plants on the app. Yeah.
Yes,
So I totally
exactly.
get. That's so
Yeah.
funny. That's awesome. And how do these like the tools that you think of, or how do these like coping mechanisms change when you're thinking about teens and the best way to help teens in
Oh,
particular?
I love this question. It's such a good question because what one of my soapboxes, so get me off of it when I'm on it too long. But is we take tools that work for adults and then we try to downsize them for teens. And yes, of course they're humans, but they're so different. They're going through so many different things. And so I guess I'm trying to think of I think recently I've just been trying to start kind of at ground zero. And one of my questions I just asked teens are, hey, how do you feel anxiety? Because we've defined this for you so many times, but what physical sensations do you have? Or thoughts do you have? And what emotions do you have? So I think it's really, or at least for me, starting at ground zero, especially at the different populations. So not trying to assume that the teens I worked with in Arkansas are the same that the teens I work with in Chicago, or let's say New Hampshire where I lived. Yeah, so I think it's really just from the beginning trying to think through how do we define anxiety, but then how can then we map tools to match their specific anxiety needs.
Like, how do you think growing up in the digital age has impacted teenagers? And that could be either they're the ones who are, glued to their phone and growing up kind of with all of this media access all around them, or not being able to have access to their phone, to a phone or to a computer while you're growing up with everyone else who is leading these lives on social media.
Let's say that they do have access to a cell phone or they do have access to a web program where they're like, oh, what's that coping skill? Or I need to learn a new strategy because I don't, want to freak out on my parents or something like that. What we've noticed a lot is teens that do have access to cell phones, that gets taken away as punishment. And usually whenever they're having these big feelings. And so what I've heard from teens is like, I'm having these big feelings, but my phone's getting taken away as punishment, or I can't use it on weekends, or I can't use it past 9 p.m. whenever I can't sleep and I'm having all these thoughts. And so I think that's one a different accessibility issue, but one that I've kind of found growing up in the digital age is something to think about that we never really have. Of if parents are using this as a punishment technique, it could actually be doing a disservice to the teens whenever they need to, or they would be helped by, hey, here's an affirmation, or here's a strategy you could use.
You have been very outspoken about accessibility in Twitter and about digital tools. Can you walk us through how accessibility may be a problem for some kids or teens, and if there is anything clinician can do to increase equity?
Yeah, no, I think so. This is a really cool question, and honestly, one that my mind has kind of grown in. So first, when I guess like 5 years ago, I wrote a grant, and I'm like, Pew Research says that, and it does, that 93% of teens have access to smartphones, and so that's how I write my grant. Like, so this is why you need to give me money to do my research because all teens have cell phones. But then I think when you look more granular, it's a lot different. So especially teens that I work with that are either from disadvantaged neighborhoods or just they don't have consistent access. So yes, 93% of teens typically have access, but they may be sharing it with their brother or sister or their mom. So I think I would say the majority of teens, or at least let's say over 50%, that it's such an easy way to get to them because their phone is glued to their hand, like actually most adults we know. But then I think what I've had to take a step back is not assume all teens have access to cell phones and think about, okay, web programs. And we've been kind of doing some fun things nerdy fun things, of if every teen's typically, or a lot of high schools given a Chromebook. So they at least have that technology, or the libraries I work with, they have laptops or computers that teens have access to, and they can jump from broadband at school to the library. Some kids even use it like at McDonald's or things like that. So I think what I've been thinking about is, okay, we need to not only make native apps, which has been a really big push the last, I guess, 5-10 years, but also we need to make them web page accessible. Because typically teens can, even if they don't have it at home, they can go, like I said, to the library and have broadband or access to technology. They can, maybe if they're given Chromebooks, like I mentioned at school, they can use that there. So I think it's just starting from the beginning of what's the platform and how do we think through that. And then I think the other big piece with equity is what we've done for so long in research is really base our research on white families and mid to high SES families. So we haven't been creating for everyone. We're just taking families that are easy to get in the laboratory or that are easy to access. So I think the other big equity piece is, and what I've really been trying to do is take a step back and like ask that anxiety question. So is anxiety the same for, again, teens in Chicago versus New Hampshire versus Arkansas, or wherever people are and do research? Is that the same? And then do these skills even help you? My dream would be if we can just create teams that actually really work for, create a set of tools that work for everyone, and think through of, okay, where is the end point? We've made these tools, but we haven't put them in organizations. So it's right now, unfortunately, pretty novel to think of libraries or to think of things like that, because we just haven't taken it from the laboratory to the organization. So that's another big vision, is getting a set of tools that works for everyone, or in different ways work caters to the needs of everyone, but then also getting in the hands and making it sustainable.
And I think one thing I would add, it's super important
please.
to get it to the hands of not only the privileged community, but the underserved people.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, for sure. 100%. And I think that's what, thank you. What I was trying to say with the make sure meets all needs, is that we've just catered to this one population, but how do we get it to everyone, and especially the underserved? And we haven't done really well at I think knowing their needs, and then co-creating programs with them to really meet those needs. And so I completely agree.
And speaking of using digital tools and accessing these things like affirmations or tools on your phone, what are ways that our listeners, for example, could utilize digital mental health tools at home? Are there easy takeaways? Of course not. It's a complex research topic. What's the low hanging fruit? Like any takeaways that listeners can begin implementing right away, like whether they're in the middle of, dealing with a mental health issue?
Yeah. So I will say there's really wonderful resources online. So Mental Health America, you can go on, especially teens, you can take little quizzes and then they'll shoot you to resources. I have a nerdy lab website that we also have been really thoughtful of putting mental health resources together. So there's handouts folks can go to that have, for instance, a suicide helpline, or we always have Mental Health America, because they're so rich with their resources. So there's so much out there that we've, and I can't even take credit. My research team gets all the credit. They've taken so much time to pull all these different resources and put them together. And then, one other one that I really like is called Cyber Guide, PSYBER Guide. And it's Stephen Schuler and his team, Dr. Stephen Schuler. He's fabulous psychologist in the research world as well. And him and his team have pulled all the mental health apps together. They've taken time to actually rate mental health apps, because that's also really tough right now. Is there's not a lot of, especially when it comes to more companies rather than research, there's not a lot of oversight. I do feel that technology gets a bad rap, and I agree that it can do a lot of harm, and social media in particular can do a lot of harm. But I hope we just don't throw all of it out then. And I think, and I guess where my heart is and what I really try to do is, how do we use technology for the good? It's a double-edged sword. And how can we use this in order to increase access? How can we use this in order to get tools to folks that need it? So I think that would be maybe a biggest takeaway is, yes, I certainly agree that there's harm there. And how can we use it for the good?
And for our listeners, whoever is listening, we're going to put a list of these resources in our description for this episode.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Science Rehashed. This episode was written by Emma Brandt and Lauren Granata, edited by Rukudzo Kanyemba, and mixed by Vesna Ilieska. The cover art for this episode was made by our creative director, Emma Brand. We'd also like to thank the whole team of Science Rehashed for making this episode possible. Today, we're highlighting one of our Science Rehashed ambassadors, Dr. Suad Narcis. Suad is an active ecologist from Algeria with a PhD in animal biology. She's also a trainer in environmental education for sustainable development, green spaces management techniques, and building projects. Suad's favorite quote is, "Science knows no country because knowledge belongs to humanity and is the torch which illuminates the world." Thanks for your hard work, Suad. If you're interested in our ambassador program, find more information on our website, sciencerehashed.com.